This is another pivot of this administration. It's like one of the first things we did was a recommit to the WHO. And that relationship is really signaling that we are part of a global effort to threats to health and security, which is what pandemics are. And so I think, we need to address the global vaccine, barriers to global vaccine effort at multiple levels. So in this administration, I have to say, we are getting there.
I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the final program of our virtual spring lecture series, number 46, examining the first 100 days of the Biden administration, a survey course for all. Before we begin the program, we'd like to share a video montage of snippets of some of the previous 7 programs, chronicling the variety of topics that we've covered during the duration of the 7 previous weeks. So sit back and enjoy the program.
Before you start making decisions on who you want to appoint, you want to have a White House structure in place.
America isn't an answer, it's a question, and we all have a role in trying to answer it for ourselves. And that's why the words are in order to form a more perfect union. It's not to inherit a more perfect union or anything like that. We all have a role in forming it.
Oftentimes when people hear the word equity, they think we're talking about making sure everyone gets the same outcomes. And that is not what equity is. Equity is, as was said, is about leveling the playing field so that everyone's efforts gets them what they've worked for.
We're trying to recalibrate and just get back to wherever we were before Trump. But it's not like the years before Trump were defined by equity.
And I have hope in the movement and the moment that we're in. And I'm waiting to see if Biden will step up to the plate.
The question now is, will Biden put the US on a path to really showing the world that we're serious about leading on this issue? And that means bold emissions cuts.
Every fraction of a degree we can avoid is hugely consequential. So we have to throw everything at it.
So the short version is, I would say the labor market is about half back. And that's probably as far as it can go until the pandemic is contained.
As the Biden administration moves forward, as the ambition gets bigger, including infrastructure and perhaps other priorities, I think that ultimately we are going to have the conversation about funding this through taxation.
There's no silver bullet. It's going to be very difficult. But somehow I'm kind of hoping that by framing and reframing where we are in this world post-pandemic, we might find some way of trying to stabilize that and find some new footing for not just the relationship with Russia, but with others as well.
But the kind of antagonisms that are generated, and quite frankly, feudal wars for the United States that are generated by dividing the world in this way, tend to predominate.
I do get a little nervous because I think that the world that I operate in is one that cares about things like the universality of human rights and is a little nervous about having to make the case for foreign engagement, multilateral cooperation, intervention of any kind by being able to say that this is benefiting America at home. It sounds a little America firsty to me.
Back then, when we had what we call cross-cutting identities, right? So you might meet someone from the other party at the same church. And so you're still in the same social group of the church, even though you're in different social groups in terms of party. That allows people to feel sort of humanized and to believe in sort of the best intentions of people on the other side.
I'm a liberal Democrat. I'm somebody who can never win in a statewide office in Massachusetts because of where my viewpoints are. But having said that, I also, go to work every day saying, okay, I know I'm not going to get everything I want, but what can I get done?
I think what the chairman said is exactly right. If you are afraid of the consequences of the next election, ergo, if you're not willing to go to the White House and meet with Joe Biden and meet with the vice president and talk to the leadership, then why are you there?
Once again, welcome everyone to the audience. I'm really, really excited about tonight's panel, which, as the title suggests, will be taking a little bit of a look back over the early days of the Biden administration in a number of really important initiative areas on President Biden's agenda, but then also asking our panel of experts to do a little crystal balling about what needs to come next. And another thing that we are including tonight in terms of themes is the big, excuse the expression, elephant in the room, which is President Biden's handling of the pandemic to date. It has been a shadow issue in all of our episodes because it impacts everything, but we have yet to have a public health expert on our panel actually addressing that directly. So without any further ado, I'd like to do a quick introduction of our panel. And tonight we have with us Esther Choo, who is an emergency room physician at the Oregon Health and Science University, Joel Clement from the Belfer Center at Harvard, Jonathan Gruber, who is an economist from MIT, and Julie Kashen from the Century Foundation. Our moderator tonight is the fabulous Eugene Daniels, who has graced us with his presence not once, but twice. And we are super excited to hear what everyone has to say tonight. So Eugene, take it away.
Thank you so much, Christina, for calling me fabulous. I think that's the best way to be introduced. For the panelists, make sure you unmute before speaking. Actually, I'd love for you just to unmute completely, because the way that we want to have this is a conversation among stranger friends, people who have just met but are ready to have this conversation about exactly what Christina was saying, this first 100 days and what's coming next. The way that we've kind of structured for the audience is kind of this 4 categories of questions. It's the way the administration has talked about the crises that they have both inherited and are dealing with. There's the COVID-19 pandemic in healthcare, the economic fallout and recovery because of that pandemic, climate change, and issues of equity and especially racial equity. So I want to start with actually what, as a White House reporter, I get some insight into what the president's going to say. So I have an excerpt, a couple of excerpts, but I'm going to read one. And then I kind of want to hear from the panelists what you think about what the president plans on saying. So first he says, now, after just 100 days, 99, I can report to the nation, America is on the move again, turning peril into possibility, crisis into opportunity, setback into strength. That is something that almost every president says, right? America is back. The union is strong. Like that is the purpose of speeches like this joint session to Congress. But it does feel like the kind of hand that the Biden administration was dealt was different than a lot of presidents. And Esther, I want to start with you on what the president says and this idea that they have this crazy hand. How do you grade, I guess, the Biden administration's first 100 days?
Well, I mean, really,
Easy question, right?
Yeah, let me just answer that question definitively. But I mean, I will say from a pandemic perspective, it has been, it was like a light went on, in January in so many different ways. And it's not like we have this thing solved. It's so difficult. Obviously, the numbers go up and down and we have variants and there's a lot of uncertainty. There's been, the challenge of distributing vaccines and distributing them equitably has been an enormous lift. And we also have really a crisis of healthcare workers right now that overlaps with, some of the other domains that we'll talk about. It has a lot to do with the economy and childcare and, employment policies that hit us too, because we're also workers. But I will say, there are a couple of really, really notable things that have happened. First of all, this is an administration that communicates extraordinarily well. Communicates. They came in knowing that we had to rebuild a lot of trust in terms of that pandemic response. And I will tell you, I get these updates on COVID from HHS. They put out these periodic updates. Whenever there's something they feel like healthcare workers, scientists need to know, they push out, bullet points from the CDC, from the Surgeon General, from Anthony Fauci and the NIH. And in March, there were 19 of these emails. So it wasn't just like, every once a week. Well, it's just like whenever we feel like there's something important of clarification. So the majority of the days in March, we had a communication with a critical update. And then I think, another thing is, so there's just a ton of communication, a lot of forums, they show up to things with different communities and stakeholders, faith groups, community health workers. They're somebody from this administration, from the health side, from the COVID-19 team is showing up and talking to people and asking for feedback, frankly. And then I think another thing is the over promising and under promising and over delivering. Sorry, so I almost said it backwards. So, setting targets that they are then exceeding, so we are going to have 100 vaccines in arms by the first 100 days. Of course, now we're at 200 vaccines. It's actually 100 million fully vaccinated, 80% of seniors, the mortality rates in seniors has just plummeted, really exceeding expectations. And that is kind of the MO of this administration. They're not going to promise something really wild, COVID will be gone by Easter kind of promises are not coming out of this administration at all. And then I think too, just having specific metrics, like very specific, concrete metrics. We're going to have X number of mobile units that go out. 90% of Americans are going to be within 5 miles of a vaccine distribution site. Really specific, targeted things so that we understand what it means when you say that you're getting going on the vaccine administration effort. And so those things are so strikingly different. So, I don't know where to put the overall grade. There are obviously a lot of challenges. There are now, really issues about how we show up well for the global pandemic effort. But I think really wonderful start from my viewpoint.
Yeah. Joel, you worked and we'll get into some of the reasons why you left the Trump administration, but you've been there for 100 days and what that looks like. And so in your experience and kind of what you're seeing, they're almost incomparable, I would say, as a political reporter, the two administrations in the first 100 days. But I am curious how they measure up.
Thanks, Eugene, because it couldn't be a more stark difference. And maybe I'll be very brief on the Trump transition, because while I was there, I was at the Interior Department. I don't think the Trump team expected to win the election, so they weren't prepared as most.
I can fact check true. They did not, from all our reporting, think they were going to win the election. Yes.
Right. And they didn't have people queued up. They didn't have nominees. They certainly didn't have policy papers queued up. So they came in, and we were kind of waiting there at the agency for some months before actually even when Secretary Zinke was confirmed, they were still putting together policy papers. It was kind of a shadow team. In contrast, I'm bullish about what the Biden team has done, particularly on climate change. And as Esther said, exceeded expectations is a good descriptor. We all knew that this incoming administration was going to focus on climate change, but there were a lot of promises made. As far as we can tell so far, many of them have been kept, at least in terms of the rhetoric coming out of the agency. They've hired some of the best climate policy, science and policy minds out there. They brought in some of the best experts to lead the agencies. The cabinet leadership, as they've all been talking about climate change. And then, last week we had that climate leaders summit that Biden hosted. That was, I feel like that event just restarted the climate conversation internationally right then, completely deleting the Trump administration's negligence over those 4 years. And on the international front, off to a fantastic start. We'll see how things go in Glasgow in the fall. That's sort of where the rubber hits the road. But domestically, it's a little harder. But they're saying all the right things. They've got all the right people. Gina McCarthy and David Hayes and many other people who know this stuff inside and out are trying to figure out how can the agencies actually make change on the ground. That's the hard part. We've all been kind of writing and thinking about that a lot, but there've been some great moves so far. So I continue to be enthusiastic about it.
As one source put it to me either today or yesterday, time's a flat circle during this pandemic. But they said it's amazing what can happen when people, one, believe in government and also kind of understand the levers of government, which, I think the Trump administration would say they weren't trying to do, right? There was this lack of inputting people into certain positions. So it does feel very different. Julia and Jonathan, I've seen your heads kind of nodding along with everyone. It seems that you both would agree that the Biden administration, that first 100 days is off to a good start. John, how about you?
I mean, I just want to summarize my feeling in the big, whew. things are back to normal. I think he's doing a superb job, but I think we can't overstate the benefits of the return to normalcy. The fact that you don't have to watch CNN all day, the fact that we're back to a productive lack of drama. That said, I think even relative to my relatively low expectations, just to fix things after the last 4 years, he's really done an outstanding job. And I think in particular, what's striking is, this isn't the Joe Biden everybody expected. I mean, Joe Biden everybody expected was a centrist creature of the Senate who was going to come in and do incremental, Clinton-like kind of little incremental changes. And he is really swinging for the fences. Now, it's hard to give him a grade till you see where the ball lands. I think that, the first, certainly Esther's right on COVID. I mean, just a great job. Although honestly, it's just sheer being decently competent makes a huge difference on COVID. So, but I think he's done great. I think, the American Jobs Plan, the $1.9 trillion bill, I think there's a legitimate debate about whether it was actually too big. Some of my economist colleagues got into that debate, but I think at this point it was a great step forward, and it showed people what the government's capable of. I think really the key question is what happens now with the two key parts of his agenda, which are the infrastructure bill and now the American Families Plan, which he just is going to announce tonight. And I think they're both incredibly ambitious, great bills. I mean, I haven't had a chance to look through the details of the jobs plan, of the families plan, but the infrastructure bill is fantastic. It covers a lot of things that people have been saying we should do for a long time. Remember, this is not socialism. Okay, the role of the government is to act where the private sector will not. Okay, where is that? That's building a road. Okay, the private sector owns the buildings. They're not going to build a road between them. That's laying broadband to every house. The private sector is not going to do that because it's not profitable. That's doing fundamental research and development. The private sector's not going to do that because fundamental research and development doesn't benefit them. Indeed, a striking fact is if you look at publications by corporate scientists. Corporate scientists used to be some of our most productive scientists in America. They'd win Nobel Prizes, things like that. Publications by corporate scientists are down 60%. Corporate scientists now just work for their company and their company only. We need public R&D investment. We need public investment in caring for our nation's elders. And these are all things that plan tackles. So I think, A+ for ambition. I think the final grade will depend on how he navigates the incredibly difficult waters of, on the one hand, with 60 votes, he can do whatever he wants. With 50 votes, he can't do anything that raises the deficit in the second 10 years under reconciliation bills. And that leads to all the sort of fiscal trickery we've seen under the Bush and Trump administrations of things expiring, which is not a very healthy way to run democracy.
Julie, yeah, go ahead. I see you nodding your head.
I would agree with a lot of that. First of all, I feel like we went from this period where there was every person for themselves, every family for themselves, let those with the most wealth, the most resources, the whitest skin, succeed, and everyone else, good luck, right? That's how it felt for 4 years. And to now have this administration that feels like, oh, wait, we're all in this together, right? We're a community, we're interconnected. What I do matters to you, what you do matters to me. And we need to fight together to, address historic wrongs. And so I feel like, that breath of fresh air that Jonathan took, I feel that, right? That we're in a very different moment. And the public goods that you were just talking about, right? That childcare and early learning are definitely part of that. And that is a big part of what's in the new plan that's going to be talked about today, right? And we saw during the pandemic just how important that is, where schools closed, childcare programs closed, and parents all over were, letting out their primal scream of how do I do my job and facilitate remote learning or care for my children, So I think we need to actually start thinking about the American Rescue Plan, where the administration heard from advocates, from stressed out moms and dads, and they heard the cries and they said, we're going to build back what we had before. Now, what we had before was not enough. We were in a huge care deficit beforehand. But we had something, we had a sector, we had childcare programs, and a lot of them had to close down. And so the first thing in the American Rescue Plan was to invest significant dollars in, getting us up to $50 billion to restore the childcare sector, to support families. So that was incredibly important. And I think, it speaks to the fact that you've got a president who has dealt with a lot of different care issues in his life, a vice president who is a stepmother and who understands and who has her own, saw her mom work and care for her and her sister. And I think they get it. And that's why they're putting care issues front and center in their infrastructure plan as well as the rescue plan.
I have no idea how parents have done it. As you can see, I'm killing this sad little plant that's like barely doing anything behind me. So shout out to all the parents that have spent this pandemic dealing, being teachers and babysitters and parents and doctors and all of that. Esther, I want to kind of go back to what is spending, what I've been talking a lot about and working on, writing a lot about, which is this vaccination effort. And the 100 days was almost singularly focused and should have been on COVID-19, getting these vaccinations out. You talked about how the goals changed. We accused them of the 100 million being already kind of low. They hit that in 58 days. They hit the 200 million, I think, in 92 days. And so they are over delivering because they're under promising. However, they are doing a lot of work on the equity piece of this. And this is a space that you work in quite a bit. Mobile vaccine units, making sure that pharmacies, giving vaccinations directly to pharmacies. So I guess looking back on the 100 days, how did they do on the vaccine equity aspect of this? We all know that Johnson & Johnson got paused. That was the one shot. That's the one I actually got. That was and I was fine.
Still good. Still really good.
All good. And that has been unpaused because of that very, very rare disorder. But other than that, how has the vaccine equity aspect of this kind of worked out? How did they do?
I mean, again, kind of a complicated answer.
Another easy question, I know.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I'll say is that, we're learning a lot of lessons about equity and inequity during this pandemic. And one of the things is it's actually very difficult to understand how well we did in terms of equity or inequity if we don't have the metrics to judge it. And you'll notice that the metrics by which we judge the success of the vaccine distribution program have entirely to do with speed. So, and you see this play out in the, some of it is on the, the state side because they have to collect and report this data. Some of it is, on the government side, they need to ask for the data and actually also be willing to report it in a way that makes the states feel okay. Some of it is on the media side, which really has done things like rankings of states by speed. When if you think about it, equitable distribution always takes time because by definition, you're talking about reaching populations that traditionally in our inequitable system are harder to reach. And so a state that is super equity conscious might very reasonably be a little slower. And how are they rewarded? You get less vaccine doses because you only get more once you've spent down what you have and you're criticized for stockpiling and sitting on doses. And so there are kind of misaligned incentives here, but the other fundamental thing is we don't have good data. We simply don't. And we saw that from the start of the pandemic. It's not just with the vaccine distribution. It's like we didn't have data on cases, on hospitalizations, on deaths that were broken down by race and ethnicity until well into the pandemic. I mean, late last spring into the summer before we had something from all the states. And even that data was often incomplete or wasn't detailed enough to disaggregate, except, and just have these very, very broad categories that obscured some very grave disparities, like not being able to separate out Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, for example, really obscured what was happening to Pacific Islanders who had some of the worst outcomes in the pandemic. So how are we doing? We have to actually create standardized metrics and some way of representing equity in the distribution process. And I know this is something that the administration is thinking very carefully about because there are also, there are a lot of barriers, including trust. Like, what is the perception if you're collecting a lot of demographic details at the point of receiving vaccine? This is not simple to just go out there and get it and then just like plaster it on some websites. And some states, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but one
please.
aspect of this that I have found really interesting on the equity piece of that, or just on the vaccine, where we're at on vaccine distribution, is that the people who seem less likely to get the vaccine based on polling tend to be men, white men that would say they were Republicans, and evangelical Christians. And so we usually, when we talk about equity, we're not usually talking about giving white people more. So I guess on that building trust aspect, what are doctors and health experts doing in that space? Because the experts I've talked to say that, we have to get a certain level of herd immunity, a certain amount of people who have the vaccine before we can really get back to life. I know today was the first day I walked without a mask on outside because of the new CDC guidelines. It felt very strange and I felt judged.
A little naked, yeah.
Exactly. I was like, I think I messed up. So I guess on that aspect of things, on making sure that we get the next group who say they don't want to get the vaccine, what should the Biden administration be doing?
Yeah, I mean, it is like, there is a distinction here between, I guess, making sure that everybody has equitable access, and then doing kind of the messaging and persuasion piece. And I will say, we all got it wrong about who was likely to be most receptive to vaccine. We're like, you Black people, let me tell you about the centuries of mistrust here and why and the truth is like, it's like in actual communities, people are like, yeah, bring it and it will be used, Right. And then I would say for the white male Republican demographic that we're finding actually has the lowest receptivity to it. It's like, at least the access piece doesn't seem to be the issue, And I think, but I think this is where we can, and then the question is like, but should, so should supply go disproportionately there? Because those are our pockets of not, of not receiving vaccine. And I think, I think it depends on community vulnerability to COVID. I think some of that is that like that demographic may feel less responsive because in their community, they were not as affected as affected by COVID. So I think focusing on a more like comprehensive score for COVID vulnerability, and then making sure that we understand how distribution is going against that will actually serve everybody. We can make sure that we're looking at inequities that break down by race and ethnicity and age and socio-demographic, socioeconomic factors, and it shouldn't leave too many people out. But there will always be the issue of like, we ensure access, and there's the other part of it, some of which is knowledge and messaging, but some of it is, in this time really politically driven. And I don't think we can spend too much ATP, pursuing a totally not receptive audience. But obviously, outreach goes to everybody.
Yeah. John, another aspect of this, the pandemic, which wasn't completely shocking, but I guess it wasn't surprising, but was still shocking to see, was this loss of millions of people lost their jobs, right? You had businesses closing, especially small mom and pop shops. So I guess we have the vaccine, some states opened up a little sooner than the government wanted, but we're opening up. Governments are allowing people to sit inside, things like that. Where does the economy stand now? And you talked a little bit about the American Jobs Plan, which is this kind of infrastructure plus bill. I think we've been calling it at Politico for the Biden administration. How should people view what the next year is going to look like when it comes to the outlook on jobs? Is there hope? Can you give the people some hope, John?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of hope, but unfortunately, I think it reinforces inequities in our society. I mean, when people ask me how I'm doing, I like to say I'm riding the top of the K-shaped recession. I mean, my job didn't change, my salary didn't change, my stock market portfolio just went through the roof. And then meanwhile, there are people who are out there every day trying to make ends meet, who are working at places that closed and may not be coming back. I mean, look, I think 5 years from now, Boston will look dramatically different than Boston looked before the pandemic, but there'll be less businesses downtown. And less businesses downtown means fewer restaurants, fewer places to get your haircut, places that provide the low and semi-skilled jobs that are a backbone of much of our economy. Where do those folks go? And I think we really, for years, have talked about sort of retraining and, trying to help people move up the skills ladder. We need to take that seriously now. A lot of these jobs are not coming back. A lot of the jobs at the bottom of the skills distribution are not coming back. Now, that doesn't mean everyone has to get a college degree. It just means we need to be thinking about retraining for the jobs that are booming. Allied health jobs. We have a desperate shortage of certified nurse assistants and other allied health jobs, made more desperate by the horrible conditions they faced during the pandemic. We need to, it was striking to me during the pandemic, we had millions of people losing hospitality jobs. People who are used to dealing with people, to go dealing with people, who didn't, with 75 hours of training, they could become a certified nurse assistant. 75 hours, it's 100 in Massachusetts, 75 in many states. That's not that much training to get a good new job. And I think people just don't realize that, in fact, the barriers to entry in these fields aren't as large as they were. So I think one thing we really to emphasize is transitioning workers to where they're needed and providing them, not transitioning, it sounds too mandatory, providing the resources for workers to transition to where they're needed, as well as moving up. The other thing is we need to also focus on moving workers up the career ladder and up the skill distribution. So I've heard this term today about a job lattice, both moving parallel and up. And I think we need to work on both things. But I think overall, the economy is doing well. I think if you look at measures like GDP, it's going to be fine. I think it's just, unfortunately, the pre-existing inequities seem like they're going to be even worsened as we come out of this.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing that I've taken from this pandemic is that everything that everyone in here knew already, right? That there were all these disparities up and down and around all of the policy areas that you guys focus on and I cover, but those were exacerbated even worse. I think the way that it was put to me at the very beginning of the pandemic by a Black health expert was, when white people get a cold, Black people get the flu, and when white people get a pay cut, we lose our jobs. And so that aspect of things has kind of stuck with me. Julie, you wrote a report in October about the loss of women in the workforce, which is, frankly, I think an underreported, undercovered aspect of the economy, because women are half of the country, if not more. And more importantly, I think what I hear from economists often, if women are doing well, the country will do well for a bunch of different reasons. And so I guess first, tell people what that loss actually looked like, what you found in your report, and more importantly, how has the Biden administration, the first 100 days, done in trying to, or at least talking about the ways in which they want to fix and bring those women back. This is something that Vice President Kamala Harris is kind of leading on for the administration. Are these plans going to cut it, I guess?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. And I have a slide about this as well, if someone wants to bring that up. Sarah Jean Glenn from the Center for American Progress, Amanda Novella at Century Foundation, and we wanted to quantify what would the losses to women and the economy be from the erosion of childcare and school supervision hours as a result of the pandemic. And what we found was, without government action, the reduction in labor force participation and work hours, because people had to be home, and caring for their children, had the potential to cost the U.S. an estimated $64.5 billion in lost wages and economic activity. So that's about the size of the GDP of New Hampshire or West Virginia. That's a lot of economic activity. And I think some things to consider are that, over the past 40 years, as more women entered the labor force and brought home larger paychecks, they actually drove more than 90% of income gains experienced by middle-class families. And right before the pandemic began in February of 2020, women held half the jobs in the US labor force. So now, as a result of, this, there was kind of this triple whammy where women, and especially Black and Latinx women, held the majority of jobs on the front lines because of occupational segregation. and are also, more likely to be the caregivers. And so they really experienced kind of the worst of this. They lost their jobs, or they had to go to work and figure out how to care for their children. And so it's just been a very challenging situation. So today, 1.5 million fewer moms of school-aged children are actively working than were before the pandemic started. So, the GDP might look good, but if you are a mom, if you are a Black mom, if you are a Latinx mom, it doesn't matter that the GDP looks good, because you are likely out of the workforce right now. And so what's happened so far is, as I mentioned, the American Rescue Plan included significant funding for childcare to help to stabilize the sector. But the US has not had a care infrastructure ever. And so I take a little issue with the infrastructure plus, because really care is infrastructure.
You're not the only one, trust me. We wrote the playbook. We got plenty of messages.
And in some ways it's semantics, because really what matters is that we invest in care system. So that means childcare and early learning. That means paid family and medical leave. That means paid sick days. That means home and community-based services. And those are the types of policies that we need to ensure that women can be successful and can, engage in the labor force in the ways that they want to and get back to work. And those are also some of those jobs that Jonathan talks about that, they can't be outsourced or they can't be automated. These are the jobs of the future that, the baby boomers are aging, and we are going to need more and more help from home and community-based, home care workers to care for them. So there's a lot here. Those are mostly women of color, mostly immigrant women. So there's a real opportunity to kind of invest in those jobs. And I think this administration is committed to doing that.
Julie, I have a question for you. Did you see, I saw a survey, I think it was done by care.com, where they showed something like 98% of workforces plan to put more into the I think it was caregiver benefits or supports for their employees. Like, it was like the #1 priority for businesses of all kinds, but there were no other details. And I just wondered, what do you think that is? Like, what are they doing? What are they planning to do? What are they jettisoning so they can do that? Like, we all appreciate we're in a crisis, but I was like, that sounds awesome. But but what's cooking there, and do you have faith in that?
I think, just to start with, that employers saw how important care is to their employees during this pandemic in a much bigger way than they ever have. It just surfaced because the kid was on Zoom with the person while they were working, right? And so, I think there's a greater awareness that employers have a stake in making sure that their employees have resources to provide care for their families, and that workers are also caregivers for the most part. So I think that was huge. I think that, what we want to see is support for providing care, support for your choices in care. What we don't really want to see is a big effort to have employers provide care at their own workplaces, because, that would be great, but that's not the solution, because you can't do that in restaurants. You can't do that in nail salons. You can't do that in dry cleaners, maybe not in hospitals. There's a lot of places where that won't work. So I think it's, we need to be thinking about how we all come together, how parents, employers, and the government partner together to solve these problems.
Yeah. Julie, to your point, the way that the administration has explained to me, both behind the scenes and calling us after we write about it in Playbook, about infrastructure, is for them and for the audience to understand, like, infrastructure for this White House and this administration, and really for Democrats writ large, is like, what does the country need to run at that time? And that is something that changes, right? Because at one point, trains weren't considered infrastructure, right? Rail wasn't considered infrastructure, and now it is. It is a part of the things we talked about. We used to didn't have paved roads, and that is a part of infrastructure. And so I think there's a conversation happening on the right where they're saying, they're trying to change the definition of infrastructure, and, Democrats push back with, no, infrastructure always changes. Joel, you have this kind of special status here. I think you're the only one, a whistleblower. You wrote in the Washington Post in kind of the summer of 2017, I'm not a member of the deep state. I am not big government. I'm a scientist, a policy expert, a civil servant, and a worried citizen. Reluctantly, as of today, I'm also a whistleblower on an administration that chooses silence over science. I don't need you to rehash, unless you want to. I don't know how traumatic it was. You don't have to rehash like all of the reasons why you blew the whistle, but there was during the Trump administration, kind of this politicization of science, but also we saw during the pandemic, masks and vaccines, but also climate change. And I guess, how do you think that has impacted the way that this administration, the Biden administration, has been able to get things done in this realm, in climate change, in science, when we've not been talking with the same vocabulary or on the same kind of, with the same set of facts?
Yeah, that's been it's been fascinating to see them spin up once again our very American interest in intellect and science and making policies based on evidence. But the Trump administration dropped the bar so low that it wasn't too hard to exceed that early on. And I think that's what's been encouraging about what we're hearing from some of the other panelists and what we're hearing from this administration on climate change is not only are they taking it to a new level, but they're inoculating it with talk about jobs and what's good for people and public service. And I think that's the thing that the Trump administration betrayed about government was, they took the public service out of it. And the reason I blew the whistle was because they were leaving communities out and frontline communities were not being served, but and that science was being disregarded. But taking that to this new level, the Biden administration is saying, not only are we back with climate change and science, but it's about people. And that frame that each of you guys have talked about, it's about people, it's about jobs, it's about health, it's about your daily life. And I don't think they could have been so aggressive on climate action and all this rhetoric without couching it in those terms. And I think in that way, they've inoculated the climate work by saying, hey, this is about jobs. Jonathan was talking about what it takes to create new jobs and building that lattice work of advancement and so on. That's the energy transition right there. But in the meantime, methane, even the American Petroleum Institute has said, well, actually, yeah, we kind of like what they're doing on methane because we've already tooled up to reduce methane leaks. We want to put those people to work. So they've kind of diffused that usual knee-jerk kind of Republican and business opposition to climate action by talking to the businesses in advance, saying, what is your interest here? And the Trump administration went straight to the extremists and the ideologues rather than asking the business executives what they thought should be done on climate change. So it's been a really interesting jujitsu and fascinating to watch. And I'm in many ways very surprised that they've diffused opposition in some ways to something that was initially seen as the boogeyman, climate change action. That's the big scary thing that was going to cost all these jobs. And they're saying, actually, that's the opposite is true. And people are ready for that. And so in some ways it's run parallel to the pandemic and all that suffering that's taken place and is seen as an opportunity to kind of shake off the energy economy of the past and look for new opportunities, good paying jobs you can be proud of, not just, something to keep you busy on the land.
Yeah. I don't want our producers to kill me, but I have one more question for Esther, especially before we move on to the student questions, because you talked about it a little bit in Lauren Joe says, haha, that's okay. All right, we're on board. So Esther, you talked a little bit about kind of like the global vaccine and how we stand in there. America is not the whole world. I know that is shocking because we often think about that. We think about ourselves first, and 4 years of that, and also more of thinking of America kind of first in all of these things. However, if we're going to beat COVID-19 as a planet, because we travel, we go to different countries at times, the global vaccine distribution has to be something. And I guess my question to you is, I have many questions about that, but I guess my biggest question, because we're seeing India really struggling. And I don't know if you guys, there hasn't been enough coverage. It's kind of blown up a little bit because it's just gotten so bad. And I think like 1% of people are vaccinated, Esther. I don't know if that's the number I saw recently. So if the US is a global leader, what can and should the US be doing to make sure that this kind of global vaccine infrastructure is there and they utilize it?
Yeah. I mean, I think we are trying to, I twitched a little at the America First phrase that
I know you guys
snuck in
probably
there
have
in the middle of a
PTSD with
sentence.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another pivot of this administration. You know, it's like one of the first things we did was a recommit to the WHO. And that relationship is really signaling that we are part of a global effort to threats to health and security, which is what pandemics are. And so I think, we need to address the global vaccine barriers to global vaccine effort at multiple levels. So in this administration, I have to say we are getting there. Talking about what do pharmaceutical companies need to do so that their formulas, their technologies are available without barrier to to other countries. Then what do we need to do in terms of getting them the raw materials, and the the pharmaceutical ingredients they need to manufacture those things, and the funds. And then what do we need to do in terms of mobilizing vaccine supply that we have in excess coming up, particularly things like AstraZeneca that were not even approved for use. It's like, and there are a lot of things that you can say that are technically true. It's like, oh, we have a legal agreement that prohibits us because we have legal liability. It's like, I think this administration is willing to be like, yes, those things are true. And there are workarounds because this is a crisis and we're not going to get held up, by some of these, potential barriers in normal times. So I think we need to have like a really holistic approach to mobilizing vaccine supply, not just for India, but for Brazil, really for, as the crisis is rolling. But it's absolutely true. I mean, if we're not, this is because it's like, this is by definition a global pandemic. We're giving variants a chance to surge. And you can see how, B117, which was this faraway problem a very short time ago, is now the dominant variant in the United States. Stuff that's happening, across the globe gets real fast if we're not on top of it. So we really, we are forced to have a global mindset if we want to ever get to the other side of this and run around without masks everywhere.
I could ask the four of you questions literally all night, but people have things to do, apparently. So I'm going to transition. We have some students, 5 students here that are going to ask our panelists some questions. All of the students have attended the Washington Center inauguration seminar. They're enrolled in a course at Suffolk University connected to this discussion series. And I'm going to let them kind of get their videos back on. And Aya, who is a freshman studying political science, has the first question. Aya?
Thank you for that introduction, Eugene. And I would like to take the time to thank our panelists for joining us in this great discussion. My question, I have 2 questions for Dr. Choo. In your article titled "Housing is an Essential Part of Healthcare, Treat 'em and House 'em," you spoke about how people struggling with homelessness have been disproportionately affected by the virus. Moving forward, should the Biden administration put greater priority into creating stable and sustainable housing options for communities, despite the $50 billion that was provided towards housing and homelessness resources in the American Rescue Plan Act? My second question falls under other issues that have been highlighted by the pandemic, like domestic violence and substance abuse, amongst others. To what extent do you think the Biden administration's past and future actions will provide a solution or at least some relief to the situation?
Those are amazing questions. I wish we had a whole hour together. I will just say, some of these things that were crises before we went into the pandemic are just kind of crises on this level that we are not prepared for. And it's clear that homelessness is one of them. It's like I live in Portland, Oregon. Homelessness is a huge issue for our city. And, across the country, we have like 500,000 homeless people without a bed that night, but a huge population of people with unstable housing. And that is a health issue. And I think what I anticipate from the Biden administration, and the signals are there, is that they are really moving towards a greater and explicit recognition that health is in every policy. It's in climate policy, it's in housing policy, it's in, transportation policy, it's in all our employment policies. And housing is that issue. It's like, what does housing have to do with me sitting in the emergency department? It's actually the #1 problem that I face every single night. I'm only an overnight doctor. And so my job is basically sorting through, especially in the wintertime, a bunch of people whose needs are not met, whose basic needs are not met in a way that feels morally, ethically wrong. And every day I discharge people, every night I discharge people that I feel like I am not behaving like a moral person because I'm discharging them in the cold with a health problem to a place where they cannot get, adequate care and live in a humane way. So this is something that's not a quick fix. We have this, this kind of emergency relief. And then as with so many other things, we need to pivot and think of the long-term solutions that feel humane, that we can live with as a society. And I'll just say quickly, you mentioned the opioid crisis, you mentioned domestic violence. Obviously, those things are so exacerbated in times of pandemic. So we also need Band-Aid and we need long-term solutions. And I will say that we have the president who is responsible for the Violence Against Women Act, which is actually one of the few policy interventions that has an evidence-based impact on domestic violence. This is a president who has a history of being effective in a place that is hard to be effective. So we need to recover, and then we need to move forward. And then for the opioid crisis, there are exciting things coming out of this administration. For example, medical treatments for opioid use disorders have really been behind a huge wall that is very hard to jump over for healthcare providers, and the Biden administration really just announced an intent to lower that bar so that all of us can get quick access to some of these evidence-based treatments for opioid use. And I think we'll see a lot more of that kind of innovation and responsiveness from this administration. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. We're going to go now to Matt, master's candidate in applied politics. All of you are very impressive. Can I just say that? So Matt, go ahead.
Thank you, Eugene. And I approve of the impressive qualifier. But my question is for Joel. Bill Hogan, a colleague of yours at the Kennedy Center, he was the mastermind behind the Texas electrical grid. I was wondering if you had spoken to him about the issues the grid faced during this winter's storm, and if you had any thoughts on the private versus public infrastructure in the future.
Thanks, Matt. That's a good question. And the short answer to your first question is I haven't spoken with Hogan about this. But what Matt's referring to is the bitterly cold weather that made its way down into Texas and really completely shut down the grid in many ways. And the knee-jerk reactions from the Republicans were it's because Texas is a big renewable energy state, and that proved to be incorrect. And what Matt's referring to in terms of the architecture of this of the grid in Texas is that it's designed for profit. It's not necessarily designed for public service. This gets back to I think my theme here of public service. And regardless of the economics, and that's not my bailiwick, and I wouldn't have a very long conversation with Hogan about that, no doubt. But there are ways to provide incentives that for states in particular, if not municipalities, to do better and not deregulate to the extent that Texas did. By putting the utilities and the profit makers in charge, you're going to get a system that can maximize profits. And we heard horror stories about some of the bills that came through after that really horrible shutdown in Texas. And the Biden administration is going to need to present grid enhancements. And they've talked about this in the context of the infrastructure proposal that demonstrate that interconnectedness, that regulation, and that public service are paramount for the grid. And this is going to be important. It already was top of mind for the energy transition folks. So, as we transition to what people like Bill Hogan might say, more intermittent sources, but turn out to be very, very reliable across an interconnected grid, we just need to make sure those interconnections work and that one player is working with another. And the Texas move to go it alone did not work out in that situation. And we're going to see a lot more events like that as the Arctic air plunges south and vice versa in the Arctic as they deal with heat waves. So grids need to be more nimble and interconnected. And that, I think, is a message we're hearing from them on infrastructure, is that we build out the interconnections and we don't allow deregulation to go wild as it has done in Texas. And there's not a lot you can do when some states are going to go their own route. But providing incentives and demonstrating that it works, that's one way to go. Thanks. That's a good question about something I know very little about, frankly.
Oh, great question. Angela, you have a master's candidate in global public policy, and you have a question.
Thank you, Eugene, for the introduction, and thank you to all the amazing panelists for being here today. So my question is for Professor Gruber. So in your book, Jumpstarting America, How Breakthrough Science Can Revive Economic Growth and the American Dream, you and your co-author mentioned that the US was able to win World War II and create the world's most successful economy through scientific and technological innovations that were generated from massive public investment. Correspondingly, throughout the first half of the 20th century, most Americans saw science as something that made their lives better. But in contrast, since the start of the pandemic, we saw high levels of disregard towards scientific advice with respect to both the COVID-19 virus and the vaccine. But with the US currently in a recession, it is pretty clear that in order to get to a place of recovery and growth, we would need widespread COVID-19 immunization. That being said, what do you think caused this pattern of rejecting scientific findings and expert advice? And what steps do you think that the current administration could take in order to reduce their doubts towards science and vaccines?
Well, thanks, Angela. It's a great question, and thanks for reading my book with Simon Johnson, Jumpstarting America. And that book is, the first third of that book is really sort of the history of sort of how public science made America great, and then how we failed it. It made America great in the sense that virtually every discovery we rely on today was based on publicly funded science. And by the mid 1960s, we were spending 2% of our entire US GDP on publicly funded science. And it gave us, importantly, it didn't just give us a bunch of cool stuff. It gave us a bunch of great jobs. And I think this comes up to an earlier part of the discussion we have, which is scientists and others, and this comes to Joel's point about the global warming plan. We need to emphasize the jobs aspect. We need to emphasize that a lot of what public science is doing and what creating new energy technology do create good jobs. The problem is, starting in the mid-1960s, we went away from that commitment. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, and it comes to a key point you're making, Angela, is scientists got worse at talking to people. Scientists really started focusing on their particular aspect and ignoring the concerns of the public, like, well, radiation's safe, don't worry about it. Things like that. The second is that scientists and politicians started disagreeing. It was easy to agree when they had a common enemy like Hitler or a common goal like going to the moon. It was harder to agree when they disagreed in the Vietnam War. And the third was budgetary pressures. And the way we do our budget in America is we have mandatory items and discretionary items. The mandatory items are our big social insurance programs like Social Security and Medicare, and they have to get paid. Discretionary, as it sounds like, is discretionary, and it's gotten squeezed. We have a narrow obsession with the deficit that's been weakened in this administration, but as a result, discretionary spending's fallen dramatically, and R&D spending's fallen under both Republican and Democratic administrations for decades. So I think one way to get faith back in science is to get people to understand that science policy is economic policy, that we cannot get back to an economy where rising tides lift boats, an economy where we create good jobs for all, unless we invest in the underlying science that makes new technologies and allows us to be the technological leader in the world. But it also, that's a little bit glib, because it also speaks to the general decaying of trust and expertise in America. And I think there's just larger issue about what do we do about the decaying trust of expertise in America. And that one, Angela, I don't have a great answer to. It's this problem that we're all in our own echo chambers. We're not talking to each other. My only answer, and it's not a full answer, but the one I believe strongly, is scientists need to get better at talking to regular people. As we get more and more specialized, we get better and better at talking only to ourselves and using terms that only we understand. And we need to be better at, not just saying, I'm smarter than you, and, climate change is real and I can't believe you don't believe it, but actually explaining to people in their terms, meaning where they are, and explaining why they should be concerned about climate change, and why they should be concerned about a number of things. And I think that's going to involve, in many ways, sort of a fundamental change to the structure of academia, which doesn't reward that activity right now. Right now, academia just rewards publishing the most narrow topics that only get published in the very best journals. And I think we need to really think about making sure we change that reward structure so, public expertise is reflected and valued.
Kate Olson, freshman studying political science.
Thank you, Eugene. My question tonight is actually for you.
Oh, okay.
My question is not about the first 100 days of this presidency, but about the first 100 days of the next president. There are expectations that Biden will be a one-term president, which makes it likely that Vice President Kamala Harris will run for office after him. My question to you is, what will Vice President Harris need to do during Biden's presidency in order to ensure that she has support if she decides to run? Are there any specific issues that you think would benefit her to focus on?
That's funny. I'm literally working on a story right now about her 100 days. So I'll give you guys a preview. So first of all, there is a lot of assumptions that because of his age, his advanced age, not that being old is bad, you either, the way my mom put it is like you get older or you die. So getting older is good. Team getting older over here. But it's unclear whether or not he will run again, right? His aides, he could never say that he wouldn't, right? But he has called himself a transitional president or bridge president. And the question is, what are you a bridge to and how long is that bridge? I think just on that part of it, I think if Trump runs again, Biden runs again. And the reason I say that is because Biden truly believed, and his aides truly believed, that he was the only person who could win during the 2020 election. And I think, well, that ended up being true. We wouldn't be able to really test it out with Bernie or any of the other folks. But when it comes to what Harris needs to do, what she's done so far is kind of focus on the job. Like 100 days isn't a lot of time to do anything. We kind of grade them, and the 100 days came from the media and during the FDR time, and it actually was a grade of like 144 days when he gave his big 100-day speech. Just a little history bit there. So it doesn't really tell you a lot of things. What she would need to do is probably focus on the economy. And so she's done some work with women businesses. She's leading this kind of labor union task force that they just started and announced this week. So she has aspects of this, but her main, I guess, portfolio is really these diplomatic relationships with the Northern Triangle countries and Mexico to kind of get at the root causes of migration. For her and anyone you talk to, that is a really meaty policy area. One, it deals with economies, it deals with foreign policy and bridge building and coalition building. It deals with what a president would have to do when it comes to working with non-governmental organizations, working with faith leaders, working with other governments to kind of get them on board to do something. So I think that does really set her up well, even if she doesn't get anything. It also is an issue that she's gonna have to work on the whole 4 years, or even possibly 8 years, because it is a tough one to get your arms around, and isn't going to be simple. And so what it looks like to the American people is like, oh, this is a woman who wants to like tackle the tough things, right? Like this is a tough thing that Biden had this exact same role in 2015 on, and he couldn't do it. And so if she even gets us past the status quo, it's going to be seen as a huge win. But I think the main thing that she needs to do is look like a really good number two. She needs to look like, and she is doing this so far, and I think they're going to continue to do that, is that her job is to make him look good. And when I say that, that's any vice president's job. She is a historic person in that she's the first Black woman, the first Black person, the first South Asian to be vice president. And so there was this idea from the media that she needs to do more and be out front more. But I think what they've kind of settled on is she doesn't need to look overly ambitious. She really does just want to govern. And there are all these allies of hers who are worried about the political ramifications of just focusing on that and not talking to donors and not, building a group. And I don't think she cares about that, frankly. How that, what that looks like at the end of 4 or 8 years of doing that, we don't know. But I think her focus and her team's focus, she's always telling them, what does Joe, she says, Joe, not me. What does Joe say about this? Are we in line with what the administration says? Is this a policy that is in line with his goals? So I think that aspect of it is going to be key for her, looking like the number two that she is, kind of doing and hanging out with him.
And Eugene, if she succeeds at adopting and reflecting back that decency and public service quality of Joe Biden, that's going to go a long way, frankly. I think that's the most important thing she could do.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. Gina, master's candidate, applied politics.
Thank you, Eugene. It's great to see you again. And thank you to all the panelists who are here today to close out this awesome series. So my question is for Ms. Kashen. So although many employers are finding it challenging to kind of discuss the when to go back to work, do you think there's a convincing argument to be made for if employees should return? And I know you touched upon this a little bit. So for those businesses that do want to end the work from home policies, how severely do you think this is going to affect low income and working families that really do struggle with the high cost of healthcare and they just can't afford to not go back to work? This question came up in my mind because our university right now is discussing whether we should go back to school in person, keep it online, but some students have actually advocated for sort of a hybrid, maybe in class online. So just wanted your thoughts on that.
I think the first thing we really need to do is build this care infrastructure we were talking about, because until we do that, we cannot make sure that we have equity in the workplace. We had so many frontline workers throughout the pandemic who had to go to work, who had to show up, right? They didn't have a choice to work from home. And so much of the time, these were the essential workers being paid poverty level wages, it's not being treated as essential workers. And so I think if we want to start with, how do we have a policy that is economically equitable, that is racially equitable, that is equitable from a gender perspective, we need to start by kind of building this care infrastructure. And then we need to think about how to transition our workforce policies and our public policies to center caregivers and to understand that there are so many people who work and also have caregiving responsibilities. So this kind of work from home flexibility matters. This kind of, things like paid family and medical leave, paid sick days, they matter. And so I think, it's got to be a more holistic look that working from home worked for some families, didn't work from others. And to be honest, working from home for the folks who were able to do it and still had caregiving responsibilities, that didn't mean, that it was easy. It just meant that they could be there. And so, I think we have a lot of work to do, but it has to go beyond the work from home conversation.
Thank you, students. Great questions, really smart. I wish I was that smart when I was your guys' age. We're gonna move on to some audience questions now. You guys seen a lot of them. And we're gonna try to get through as many of them as we can. We're gonna go to 7:20. I've been given the green light to keep you guys a little late. One thing I will say, I hope that, like, just kind of on this idea of where we're going, are we going back to work? The thing that I hope that we kind of learned, and I've seen us learn a little bit as Americans, I don't know about globally, it's kind of like to be more empathetic and like our bosses now know that what the inside of our houses look like. Are they paying us enough? Like you talk about that care economy, there's like a kid running and attacking you while you're in a Zoom meeting. And so that humanizes people in a way that I think, if I had to choose a silver lining, I guess, for the pandemic, it would be that, right? Is that it looks like there might be some changes in the way that we think about people as not just work output, but also as, humans who happen to work. So I'll start with the first question from RJ, and this is to Dr. Gruber. President Biden has made his American Jobs Plan, this kind of infrastructure plan, all about competing with China. Do you believe this is an appropriate way to frame the conversation around this bill?
Eugene, there's the question, is it right and is it politically savvy? I think competition with China is important. I think that the right way to respond to the economic challenge posed by China is not to slap on tariffs or wave a big stick, but to actually out-invent China. And so I think it's a very important motivation for infrastructure investments and for investments in R&D, on which I'm very focused. I think it's a useful driving analogy, because I think that America does best when we have a goal, as we talked about sending a man to the moon, et cetera. And I think China gives us that external goal, but it shouldn't be the only one. We all got freaked out about Japan, and then Japan ended up not being as big competition as we thought. If we all get focused on China and 3 years from now China collapses, I don't want to be us to think, well, we're done, we can just hang up our hats. I think the real motivation in the US needs to be not external, but internal, which is that we're a nation that's growing slowly and growing apart. And that our motivation needs to be, how do we get grow faster and grow together. And I think that if we rely on external motivations only, I fear that when those change, we won't respond enough.
Yeah, there's this kind of policy that the Biden administration has, and it's been described to me as like an omni policy, where both foreign policy and domestic policy to them, because the world is so connected now, everything's so connected, and so they're always thinking about, what are this infrastructure plan has nothing to do with China, right? It's about getting jobs here, but then adding that foreign policy aspect, like you said, Gruber, is fascinating, and we will all continue to see that kind of framing from them. This question is, I think, for kind of like a Joel and Julie tag team here. So what steps can the Biden administration take to center the care workforce in climate action? So you see Joel, I'll start with you.
That's a good, I don't know. I think probably Julie's going to have a lot more to say on this one, but climate action, the beauty, I think, of this interweaving of crises, if there is one, is that the public health crisis, the climate crisis, and the social justice crises all interact so that what's good for one is good for the other. And I think that the more they are able to frame these, whether they're climate actions as good for social justice or equity, and equity actions also help us advance our climate goals, that's going to make a big difference there.
And I'll add two things to it, which are that, care jobs are low emission jobs, right? They are very sustainable jobs. These are, jobs that are actually, very, they fit within a positive climate framework. And the Feminist New Deal actually just came out with a report that shows the connection between care and climate. I think another piece that was really striking to me, that I kept following these amazing climate change activists, primarily women on Twitter, who were saying like they can't do their work right now because they don't have childcare and because they were spending so much time. And so I feel like if we want, caregivers and mothers to be a part of the climate movement, we have to have a really solid care infrastructure.
So this question's for you. There are many states that have set dates for lifting restrictions on businesses. Do you believe this is the right action for states to be taking and setting the exact dates for the lifting restrictions, I guess, as opposed to kind of letting the information that we're getting at the time, how much spread there is and vaccinations in the area, kind of lead them?
Yeah, I mean, absolute deadlines for anything has not worked out well for us. In this pandemic, starting from, last year, where we kept on having these announcements that you're good to go by July 4th, and everybody just kind of planned their celebrations and their large group gatherings. And so, I mean, the idea is that we're comfortable with it depends, like the goal is for school openings, but it depends. Can we get our teachers vaccinated and comfortable going back to school? Can we shore up schools of all kinds so that children are safe, that we have the policies and the physical structures in place so that people can go back to school and be and families can feel safe. And so that's not like, this is part of health communication where we run up against people's expectations for what scientists can do. And like all along, people wanted really definitive answers. And there was this kind of meta education we needed to do, which is that real scientists often don't know. And also need to be nimble in the moment and say, I can't tell you if you'll be open by next month, but I can tell you that here are the conditions for that. And this is how science works, that we have to wait for data to come in before we can say definitively that here is the advice based on data in that moment. Especially when you're dealing with a disease entity that we're still learning about. And so I think there's uniform, we will open has poor rationale. And I think we are really seeing that we need to attack this pandemic often at the community level, depending on what's happening on the ground. And I mean, it's even true for vaccination. Like, does vaccination prevent you from reinfection? Yes, but it actually depends on community. It depends on community rates of COVID. I mean, if you have incredibly high rates and high disease entity, actually the vaccine cannot perform as well because, the performance of a vaccine depends on local prevalence. So everything it depends. And I know that's not very satisfying, but that is actually how public health decisions are made.
And how science works. All of us reporters who didn't cover health ever have, had to over the last year. And I think the easiest way it was described to me was like, science is based on evidence and evidence changes. So when at the beginning, when they were saying not everyone has to wear a mask, well, then we realized that everyone needs to put on a mask, like that.
So you lied.
Yeah,
So you
exactly.
lied at the beginning, right?
Exactly. And so, maybe they don't take it to heart as much, everyone. So we have about 3 minutes before we want to wrap. So I want to give a question to all of you, and as quickly as you can. How this pandemic has been terrible in many ways, but I wonder on the kind of the long-term impacts in the spaces that you cover, whether it's good or bad. Would love to end on a good note. What are the long-term impacts that this year plus in our homes, wearing masks, scared of COVID-19, hundreds of thousands of people dying in this country because of it? What are the long-term impacts that you guys see it in your lane of work? And Joel, I'll start with you.
Thanks. That's a good question. And I've been thinking a lot about that because the climate action efforts have been, I think, as I mentioned earlier, enhanced by the fact that all these crises are intermingling: the social justice crisis, the public health crisis, and the biodiversity crisis as well. And so these actions that serve one of these can serve others. So in a way, it's expanded our thinking about how we can address social problems and kill multiple birds with one stone, to use a very inappropriate metaphor.
Jonathan, how about you?
I'm an optimist by nature. I got to say, the most patriotic I felt in a long time was standing in line for my vaccine. And I just felt like here's a nation that came together, took on an enormous challenge in a tenth the time anyone thought was possible, created a vaccine. I'm feeling really optimistic that there can be, to the question that was asked, there can be a newfound respect for science and for realizing that we can challenge we can tackle some of these enormous problems. Let's move on from COVID and let's turn to cancer and global warming and the other big problems that we thought we couldn't deal with. And now maybe we can.
I don't know about you guys, I cried when I got mine. I was like kind of shocked by how emotional I was. Yeah. And on Sunday, I'm flying to South Carolina to see my grandmother for the first time.
Yay.
Because we're both fully vaccinated. So,
social medicine.
Get those vaccinations, y'all. Julie, how about you?
I think the invisible care work that Black women, Latinx women, immigrant women, that mothers of all races have been doing for a very long time became visible during the pandemic. And that has led to policy and action. And I think that is a really great outcome from a really awful experience.
Yeah. Esther, you'll let you round us out here.
I'm going to say 3 really optimistic things since Jonathan, made the point of being optimistic. So one, I think we're going to learn how to operationalize health equity. We don't actually know how to do this at scale. I think we're going to learn. I think we're going to reinvest in public health because we saw what happens when you don't invest in it, when you actually make it, withdraw funding for many, many decades and then expect it to perform well. And then I think we're really going to finally take on the crisis of burnout among healthcare professionals because we are really hurting right now with, in my state, about 20% of nurses have left the workforce. And we are really feeling that. And burnout has been at crisis for a long time. And I think we're finally going to take it on.
Thank you so much, the 4 of you. This has been such a great conversation, and I could have done it so much longer. And also thank you for the great work that you're doing. It's not a partisan statement to say the better that we take care of each other in all the aspects that you guys work, the better we will be as a country. And thank you to the audience. And Christina, here you are to close this out.
It's a big task and a hugely impressive panel to follow. But I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you for your time and your expertise and for having exactly the kind of public, easily consumable conversation that we need to have about all of these different topics, right? We need to fix our infrastructure. So yes, infrastructure is everything, right? I think that's a message that came out loud and clear in all that you were saying. It's jobs, it's health, it's the invisible economy, it's care work, and it's caring for one another. And what I also appreciate about this is that you sounded an optimistic note. There is kind of light at the end of the tunnel, but that you also gave our audience and our students a really strong message about a call to the importance of civic engagement and the importance of public service. So thank you all for what you do. Thank the audience for hanging in with us for all of the territory that we've covered since prior to the inauguration, which actually thankfully happened. And I guess it's now time for us to close and get ready on one day before the 100th day to listen to President Biden's joint address to Congress. So thank you all and have a good night. Bye, everyone.